The third main competitor in the ongoing console wars is PlayStation. Now on the fourth console in its series of consoles, tussling with the likes of Nintendo and Xbox for sales globally, when did the PlayStation join the mix? How did they get to where they are today? It all started in 1988, where Sony executive Ken Kutaragi had finished being manager of the hardware engineering division. Now, the PlayStation was intended to be a venture between now long-time rivals Nintendo, which later fell apart due to disputes on how the revenue would be split. So, with Nintendo going its own way, it resulted in PlayStation being created to directly compete with Nintendo. This sparked a fair amount of controversy within Sony, with the deal break being a complete humiliation. Kutaragi was moved to Sony Music Entertainment to continue with the project in 1992, and in 1993 Sony finally gave the go-ahead to the project after it had spent enough time in development. At the end of 1994, on December 3rd, the first PlayStation console hit the Japanese shelves, making it to the rest of the world by the end of 1995. The console was a massive success in Japan, selling 2 million copies in the first 6 months. The console went on to deliver great original titles like Rayman, Spyro and Crash Bandicoot, which are still going strong today, with their remasters generating a lot of hype globally. Let's not forget the original controller, by the way, which didn't have any joysticks. This is something that many at the time wouldn't have seen as much of an issue, given the common style of all controllers. But today's controllers look almost naked without them. This is where the DualShock controller comes in. In 1997 for Japan and 1998 for everywhere else, the DualShock controller was launched with dual analog sticks, but was also introduced with vibration feedback in the controller, something still in the controllers today. Now, whilst the original PlayStation was pretty impressive, its competitors were catching up and were actually set to overtake in terms of technology. Adding more games to the console wasn't going to be enough, so a new console was in order. Enter the PlayStation 2, abbreviated to PS2 for most. The PlayStation 2 was released almost directly after the launch of the Sega Dreamcast, and you can guarantee that that wasn't a coincidence. Whilst this may have been their intention, the PlayStation 2 had to compete with the Xbox and the GameCube. Launched in the year 2000 for Japan, the PS2 made tremendous strides in the market, selling over 980,000 units in the first month and making an estimated $250 million in its first day across consoles, games and accessories for the PS2. It's also no secret that Sega's discontinuation of their console at the time, a short 18 months after its release, is because of PlayStation's immense industry pressure. 4 years into the life of the PlayStation 2 came the console's best-selling and easily most controversial game, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. The game sold 17.3 million copies globally in its time, but was shunned by many for multiple reasons, most prominently the Hot Coffee mod, where players can have sex in-game with it being covered by convenient camera angles, but the premise was still there. The game rating was actually increased from M for mature to AO, adults only. This didn't stop the game from becoming a classic amongst modern day gamers, and was actually a defining game of many people's childhood. On a personal note, the PlayStation was the console that I played the most as a kid with my mum, playing games like Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex, Kingdom Hearts, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, just to name a few. Even going back through games from the original PlayStation using its backwards compatibility feature. For me, the PlayStation 2 will always be the standout console of the PlayStation franchise, as it's collected some of my favourite memories as a kid, and, for me, marking a turning point in the games industry. Whilst Sony saw that the PlayStation was performing really well globally, they saw another market that was lacking competition, one dominated by their dreaded nemesis, Nintendo. That was the handheld gaming market. At this point in time, 2003 to 2004, Nintendo had the monopoly on handheld gaming, with it being their metaphorical turf that everyone respected and left alone. However, Sony weren't ones to back down from a challenge, and retaliated with their answer to the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, and a direct competitor to the Nintendo DS, the PlayStation Portable. The PSP, as it was called, launched a month after the Nintendo DS, and was far superior in terms of processing power. It also differed from the Nintendo DS in almost every single way, even down to the games, with the DS using cartridges and the PSP using Universal Media Discs, UMDs for short. Whilst it was announced in 2003 at E3, Sony were careful not to release any specifics as to its technological aspects. It was a few months after its Japanese launch at the end of 2004 that it made its way to America in March of 2005, having sold 200,000 units on its first day alone. When it made it to the UK a month later, it sold out within an estimated 3 hours of its launch, despite a higher price tag justified by higher VAT in the United States compared to the United Kingdom. The PSP console turned into its own family of console, releasing a plethora of PSP variants, including the PSP 2000, PSP 3000, PSP Go, which was a slide variant of the PSP, and the final entry to the family, the PSP Street, which launched in 2011. Most of these only had minor performance differences, but the difference between the original PSP 1000 and the PSP Street is very noticeable. By the end of its time, the PSP family sold 76.3 million units globally. With the PS2 and the PSP performing exceptionally well, it was now time for PlayStation to evolve, making the PlayStation 3 their 7th generation console attempt. Announced in 2005 at E3, the PS3 promised to deliver a gaming experience that will be unparalleled, and both adopted and introduced now popular aspects. Firstly, the console was the first ever to use Blu-ray discs and would feature the answer to Xbox Live, the PlayStation Network, as well as being the first console to have a HDMI port. Now, the original PS3 had 2 HDMI ports, 3 Ethernet ports and 6 USB ports, which was clearly overkill and unnecessary, not to mention it wasn't very cost efficient. When it was shown again a year later at E3 2006, it was dialed back to 1 HDMI, 1 Ethernet and 4 USB ports. Its first launch was in November 2006 in Japan, where just under 82,000 consoles were sold in the first 24 hours. When it made its way to the US just a week later, it triggered something amongst gamers across the country. One customer was shot, others were robbed at gunpoint, with many fighting over the remaining consoles before they sold out. It was some time before it came to Europe, being delayed until March 2007, but still managed to sell around 600,000 consoles in its first 2 days. Later on in its cycle, slim versions of the console were released, with the original being a bulky and quite frankly not the best looking console that took up a lot of shelf room, but made sense given the inner workings. The console also featured the newest of the PlayStation controllers, the DualShock 3, and whilst the name doesn't seem to inspire more originality, it was the first wireless DualShock controller. Now, the PSP didn't beat the Nintendo DS, we know that, but still had a massive audience and was very popular. So when it came to looking at another generation of handheld console, they made the PlayStation Vita. Released in 2011 in Japan and 2012 everywhere else, the PS Vita had a massive leg up over its competitor, the Nintendo 3DS, in terms of technical capabilities, as it did with the original PSP 1000. Now, the PS Vita in Japan had a great start, selling over 300,000 units in its first week alone, but dropped to 73,000 units for the following week, and then to around 12,000 the following weeks after. This was reflected in a similar fashion in the United States, selling 200,000 units in its first month, but then dropping to about 50,000 a month. Even with the console getting great exclusive titles, its sales continued to suffer, to the point that Sony stopped displaying its sales record individually and instead opted to show it as a combined number with the more popular PSP range. With the next generation of PlayStation console, the PS Vita had some interesting functionality, but didn't do much for its sales. The console mostly had third-party Japanese titles towards its later years, showing that the handheld market is, and will most likely forever be, in Nintendo's firm grasp. Finally, we have the current generation of console, where PlayStation is still going strong with their 8th generation console, the PlayStation 4, releasing across the globe at the end of 2013. The PS4 was the console with all the trimmings, and its launch seemingly went off without a hitch. According to PlayStation, the console received over 1 million pre-orders, and in North America over 1 million consoles were sold at its launch. In the UK, the console broke the record of the best-selling console at launch, selling 250,000 consoles in its first 48 hours, rocketing to 530,000 in its first 5 weeks. The console put a lot of emphasis on the social aspects too, adding a social button to its controller, and parties like on Xbox Live. The DualShock controller also saw a mild overhaul, with the PS4 controller having a touchpad and motion controls for certain games, with a backlight on the controller that would light up in different gaming events. The PS4 was the first, and technically still the only console to adopt and endorse virtual reality. Sony created the PlayStation VR as an accessory for the console with a crazy high price tag, but allowed for an accessory that already existed and that never really took off to finally have its moment in the spotlight. This was the PlayStation Move motion controllers. They were pretty much just glorified Wii remotes, but did look pretty cool. With the rise of the smartphone, PS4 had second screen play, allowing players to stream gameplay to a handheld device, which doesn't really have much of a purpose in itself, but it was there, right? Things like live streaming and clip capture were implemented, and backwards compatibility was later added, but not in the way that many wanted. Instead of being able to insert the disc like with Xbox One's backwards compatibility, it was almost like an emulator and a service called PlayStation Now, which was essentially another membership to play games. Now, it's worth adding that the PlayStation 4 Slim was released in 2016, which was subsequently followed by the PlayStation 4 Pro, a PS4 on steroids allowing for 4K gaming experiences and the answer to the Xbox One X. Not much else of importance was added besides these spec upgrades, but did tremendously increase the quality of both 4K ready games and the virtual reality performance. And that brings us up to date on where PlayStation is at now. Who knows if another console will be released after PS4 Pro, as it seems a lot of effort went into the creation of the more powerful console, bringing it ever closer to that of PC performance. What would the PS5 look like? I guess we'll have to wait and see.